On the damp morning of March 3, 1943, Captain Commander Hideo Kuboki of the Japanese destroyer Arashio stood on the bridge, watching the horizon through the mist of the Bismarck Sea. Below, weary sailors pulled drenched, oil-covered survivors from the water. Men from the transport ship Kyokusei Maru sunk the previous day. The convoy of Operation 81, carrying reinforcements to Lae, New Guinea, had already lost one vessel to American B-17s. Still, Kuboki and his fellow commanders believed the worst was over. They were only hours away from Lae, and once within range, fighter cover from the base should see them through safely. Then around 10 a.m., a lookout shouted a single word that changed everything: aircraft. What appeared in the southwest was unlike any air attack Kuboki had ever encountered. These were not the high-flying B-17 bombers that had attacked the day before from 5,000 feet, where anti-aircraft fire at least had some effect. These planes were different. American B-25 Mitchells and Australian Beaufighters flying so low their propellers seemed to slice the sea spray. They were fast, coordinated, and coming in at near sea level in an attack that would forever change naval combat in the Pacific. Within seconds, the time it took for a delayed fuse bomb to skip across the water, Kuboki's ship would be torn apart. Arashio's steering was destroyed, sending her smashing uncontrollably into the transport Nojima Maru. In just 15 minutes, the convoy was in ruins. 7 transports carrying 6,900 troops were either on fire or sinking. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been lost or heavily crippled. This was not a routine convoy strike. It was the moment-skip bombing, a tactic developed secretly by American airmen, proved that surface ships could not survive within range of land-based aircraft. For the Japanese commanders who endured it, this was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 2 months earlier, in January 1943, the disaster had not yet unfolded. At Rabaul, New Britain, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura of the Japanese 8th Area Army faced a worsening crisis. The Allies had just seized Buna on the New Guinea coast after months of fierce fighting, and now threatened the vital bases at Lae and Salamaua. These were not ordinary outposts. They were key to Japan's defense of the Southwest Pacific, guarding the approaches to Rabaul, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, where nearly 100,000 Japanese troops were based. If Lae fell, the Allies would gain a clear path along the New Guinea coast, endangering the Philippines and eventually even Japan itself. The logistics were harsh and unforgiving. Every soldier, every weapon, every bag of rice had to be shipped from Rabaul across the dangerous waters of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. The distance was only 500 miles, but with Allied air power growing at Port Moresby and Milne Bay, it might as well have been 5,000. Convoy attempts were already proving costly. On January 7th, a Japanese convoy carrying the 102nd Infantry Regiment, under Major General Toru Okabe, did reach Lae, but not without serious losses. The transport Nichiryu Maru was sunk by an Australian Catalina flying boat, taking 361 soldiers and all of Okabe's medical supplies with it. Another ship, Myoko Maru, was so badly damaged it had to be abandoned on the beach. Reinforcing New Guinea was becoming almost impossible. General Imamura understood the stakes. Allied intelligence pointed to a major offensive on the horizon. If Lae could not be reinforced with at least a division, it would fall. After intense debate with his staff and naval commanders, the decision was made. Operation 81 would be launched. This massive convoy would deliver 6,900 troops of the 51st Division in a single effort. The risks were acknowledged at the highest levels. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself warned losses could exceed 50%. Yet the alternative, landing troops far up the coast and forcing them to march through hostile jungle, likely meant even more deaths from starvation, disease, and constant Allied air attack. The order was given. The convoy would sail. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, age 54, was chosen to command the mission. A veteran destroyer officer, he had fought numerous night battles in the Solomons where Japanese destroyers had gained a fearsome reputation. For Operation 81, his task force was formidable. 8 destroyers, all hardened veterans of Guadalcanal, flying his flag aboard Shirayuki. Kimura also had Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and Asagumo. These names carried weight among Allied sailors who had clashed with them in the night battles of the Solomon Islands. But this time Kimura's challenge was different. His swift warships, used to high-speed Tokyo Express runs, now had to protect 8 slow, heavy transports carrying troops and supplies. The convoy could make only 7 knots, barely faster than a man could jog. For a commander used to racing through contested waters at 30 knots, the slow pace must have felt agonizing. Every extra hour at sea risked exposure. Every mile in daylight gave Allied aircraft more chances to strike. Meanwhile, 500 miles away at Port Moresby, a very different commander faced the same problem from the opposite side. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, leader of the U.S. 5th Air Force, had struggled for months to sink ships from the air. High-altitude bombing had proven nearly useless. During the January convoy battle, his forces had flown 416 sorties and sunk only 2 ships, a poor return in war. Kenney knew that unless he could reliably stop Japanese convoys, General MacArthur's New Guinea campaign risked stalling into bloody stalemate. Kenney had always been an unconventional thinker. Before the war, he was known for pushing radical ideas against traditional doctrine. In 1928, while teaching at the Air Corps Tactical School, he had outlined a new concept: skip bombing. Bombs would be dropped at very low altitude so they would bounce across the water like skipping stones before striking a ship's hull. The idea was dismissed at the time as reckless and impractical. But now, with the New Guinea campaign at stake, Kenney decided it was time to make the theory real. Testing began under Major William Benn, commander of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron. Through repeated trial runs, they refined the method. Planes had to attack at just 200 to 250 feet altitude, flying 200 to 250 miles per hour. The bomb needed to be released between 300 and 600 yards from the target with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. Release it too high and the bomb would not skip correctly. Too low, and the bomber could be destroyed by its own blast or debris from the target. The margin for error was almost non-existent, but when executed correctly, it promised devastating results. General George Kenney knew that skip bombing alone would not guarantee success. The low-flying bombers would face a wall of anti-aircraft fire during their attack runs, and something had to be done to suppress it. This is where another innovator entered the story, Major Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, age 43. A former U.S. Navy pilot who had become Kenney's trusted problem solver for unconventional ideas. Gunn was already a legend in the Southwest Pacific. When the war began, he was a civilian pilot in the Philippines. His family was captured by the Japanese and held at Santo Tomas prison camp in Manila. That personal loss gave him a relentless drive for payback against the Japanese military. Gunn's mechanical creativity turned into the key for making skip bombing survivable. Taking a standard B-25 Mitchell, he ripped out the bombardier's compartment in the nose and replaced it with 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. He then mounted 2 more on each side of the fuselage and added another 4 under the belly. The result was a flying gunship, bristling with forward firepower. When Kenney first saw Gunn's modified bomber, nicknamed Pappy's Folly, he immediately grasped its potential. "Pull out everything from the nose and load it with 50 calibers, Kenney told him. "Strap more to the sides. I want maximum forward firepower, enough to blast through the deck defenses of a Japanese destroyer." Throughout February 1943, these modified bombers trained intensively. Their practice target was the wreck of the SS Pruth, a passenger ship that had run aground off Port Moresby in 1923. Day after day, the B-25s came in at mast height, unleashing streams of gunfire before dropping bombs that skipped across the water and slammed into the rusting hulk. The results were striking, far more accurate than anything achieved with high-altitude bombing. Still, hitting a stationary wreck was one thing. Attacking a moving convoy defended by alert gunners and enemy fighters would be an entirely different test. The Australians also played a central role in shaping the new tactics. Number 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, flying Bristol Beaufighters, had been developing their own methods for low-level strikes. The Beaufighter, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, was perfectly designed to smash shipboard defenses. Group Captain Bill Gehring, an experienced RAF officer who had fought anti-shipping battles in Europe, proposed a combined attack plan. The Beaufighters would go in first at near-mast height, raking enemy ships with cannon and machine gun fire. Immediately behind them, the skip-bombing B-25s would make their runs. Overhead, B-17s would drop from high altitude at the same time, splitting the convoy's defensive fire and creating total confusion. On February 14th, Allied reconnaissance photographs of Rabaul Harbor revealed a shocking sight. 79 vessels gathered in port, including 45 merchantmen and 6 large troop transports. It was clear that the Japanese were preparing for a major reinforcement convoy. Just 2 days later, the Allies' most closely guarded advantage confirmed it. Ultra-intelligence, the ability to decode Japanese communications, uncovered the details. Codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington decrypted messages showing that a convoy would leave Rabaul on February 28th, bound for Leh. It would be carrying reinforcements from the 51st Division. The messages even outlined the convoy's route and its expected arrival on March 5th. For Kenney, this was the chance he had been waiting for. He ordered his senior officers to Port Moresby for final planning. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, his deputy and commander of the forward echelon in New Guinea, was assigned overall coordination of the strike. The plan demanded maximum effort from every available aircraft. The force assembled was the largest airstrike yet attempted in the Southwest Pacific, 219 aircraft in total. It included 90 heavy bombers, a mix of B-17s and B-24s, 41 medium B-25s, 34 light A-20 Havocs, and 54 fighters, split between P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks. Among the pilots, the mood was mixed. Many were excited at the chance to use their new tactics in combat, but some were uneasy. Skip bombing was still experimental, and many had never attempted it outside of training. Lieutenant Charles Howe of the 3rd Attack Group voiced what others were thinking. "We're going to be sitting ducks that low. One lucky hit from a destroyer and that's it." But Major Ed Larner, who would lead the skip bombing wave, spoke with steady confidence. "We've trained for this. Trust the plan. Go in fast, hit hard, get out. The bow fighters will clear the way." Meanwhile, in Rabaul, the Japanese prepared their convoy with precision. Each transport was combat-loaded, meaning supplies and equipment were packed in reverse order to speed up unloading at Leh. A total of 5,954 soldiers from the 51st Division's 115th Regiment boarded their assigned ships, the Ayo Maru, Kembu Maru, Nojima Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, and Teo Maru. An 8th ship, the Kyokusei Maru, carried aviation fuel and vital supplies for Japanese air units at Leh. The destroyers also took on 958 additional troops, crammed into every available space. This convoy carried more than manpower. Some of Japan's most important commanders in New Guinea were on board. Lieutenant General Hatazō Adachi, leader of the entire 18th Army, embarked on the destroyer Tokitsukaze. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division, sailed aboard the Yukikaze along with his divisional staff. Concentrating so much senior leadership in one operation was unusual. It reflected both Japanese confidence in their destroyer escorts and the desperation to get key officers to Leh to stabilize the collapsing front. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura's operational plan drew on lessons from earlier failures. Rather than take the direct route across the Solomon Sea, which would expose the convoy to attack for the maximum time, he chose a longer but safer course. The convoy would sail north from Rabaul, then turn west along New Britain's northern coast, using the mountains as cover from Allied radar and to shield against southern air attacks. The final stretch would be the riskiest, through the narrow Vitiaz Strait, then down the Huon Gulf to Leh. At its tightest, the strait was only 50 miles across, forcing the convoy into a predictable corridor where it would be most exposed to airstrikes. For air protection, Japanese Navy and Army air units at Rabaul pledged 100 fighters to patrol in rotation above the convoy. In reality, this promise was less effective than it sounded. The distance from Rabaul to the Vitiaz Strait was at the extreme limit of their range, allowing fighters to stay on station only for short intervals before refueling. On top of that, many Japanese pilots were exhausted from months of non-stop missions, and their aircraft were worn out, with spare parts in critical shortage. The truth was simple. The convoy could only count on reliable air cover for part of its voyage. On the night of February 28, 1943, the ships finally departed. As darkness settled over Simpson Harbor, the transports eased away from the wharves one by one, decks packed with soldiers staring back at Rabaul, perhaps realizing it might be their final glimpse. Around them, destroyers moved into protective positions, their crews tense and ready even in home waters. Submarines had struck close to Rabaul before and no chances would be taken. From the bridge of his flagship Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura watched as his convoy formed into two neat columns. Destroyers took station on the flanks and in the lead. At exactly midnight he gave the order. 7 knots, course 350 degrees. The convoy slipped into the black waters of the Bismarck Sea. The first day passes quietly. For once the weather, usually the sailor's greatest enemy, turns into their shield. 2 tropical storms sweep across the Solomon and Bismarck Seas, bringing thick clouds and heavy rain that conceal the convoy from Allied reconnaissance. The Japanese soldiers and sailors, many seasick from the sluggish rolling of the overloaded transports, still feel relief each hour they remain unseen. But Rear Admiral Kimura knows luck cannot hold forever. The storms are breaking apart, and with clear skies tomorrow he expects American bombers to appear. His fears prove correct. At 3:00 p.m. on March the 1st, as the convoy rounds Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain and begins moving south toward the Vidiaz Strait, the clouds lift briefly. At that moment, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group, flown by Lieutenant Walter Higgins, passes overhead on routine patrol. Higgins can hardly believe the sight below. 8 transports and 8 destroyers, exactly as intelligence predicted. He immediately radios in his report, triggering the sequence of events that will lead to one of the Pacific War's most decisive battles. At 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby, Higgins's contact report electrifies the staff. General George Kenney orders the attack plan into action, yet there's a complication. The convoy has been located earlier than expected, and still north of the Vidiaz Strait, where Japanese fighters from New Britain can provide heavier cover. General Ennis Whitehead makes a key choice. The first strike will use B-17 high-altitude bombing to damage and slow the convoy. The critical low-level skip bombing runs will wait until the convoy enters the narrower strait, where maneuvering will be more difficult. On the morning of March the 2nd, the weather clears as the convoy continues south. 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses appear, flying at 6,500 feet in tight formation, while roughly 30 Japanese fighters rise to intercept them. The Japanese transport captains, most of them civilians pressed into military service, watch in horror as the massive 4-engine bombers release their payloads. Tall plumes of water erupt around their ships as most bombs miss, but probability favors the Americans. The transport Kyoku Maru suffers a direct hit, splits in 2, and sinks rapidly. Another transport takes damage and drops behind. Captain Sato Yasuo, commanding the destroyer Asashio and leading Destroyer Division 8, immediately orders his men to rescue survivors. Nearly 700 sailors and soldiers are hauled aboard from the oil-slicked waters, crammed into every space available. While humane, this decision leaves Asashio dangerously overloaded and far less maneuverable. As darkness falls on March 2nd, Rear Admiral Kimura faces a crucial choice. The convoy, still 12 hours from Leh, has already lost 1 transport, and others are damaged. He must decide whether to press on together at reduced speed, keeping formation but remaining exposed longer, or to split the faster ships and get at least part of the force to Leh more quickly. Kimura chooses unity. He signals all ships, maintain formation, we proceed together. What Kimura doesn't know is that Allied intelligence has intercepted and decoded his message. General Kenney and Whitehead now have precise details on the convoy's speed, position, and formation. The stage is set for the new low-level attack method that will transform naval warfare. That night, Allied crews receive their final briefings. The atmosphere is tense. Pilots and gunners double-check every weapon and system. Many quietly write letters home, fully aware that tomorrow they will fly straight into point-blank fire from Japanese ships. At dawn on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea lies calm beneath clear skies. Perfect flying weather. The convoy advances at 7 knots, now in the confined waters near the Huon Gulf. The surviving transports close ranks while destroyers form a tight defensive screen around them. Admiral Kimura orders strict fire discipline. No gun is to open fire unless commanded, saving ammunition for the battle he knows is imminent. At 10 a.m., the first wave of attackers arrives. But instead of the expected high-altitude bombers, 13 Australian Bristol Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, led by squadron leader Charles Claude Ridley, skim across the sea at wave-top height, their propellers leaving visible trails across the surface. Behind them, still distant but closing fast, the B-25 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group appear as dark shapes against the sky. On the destroyer Arashio, Commander Hideo Kuboki has only seconds to react. Years of naval training flash through his mind. The speed and approach angle of the aircraft, the limited depression of his guns, the need to shield the transports while maneuvering his own ship. But time runs out. The Beaufighters strike first. Their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns unleashing a torrent of fire that rips across Arashio's decks. Explosions cut down anti-aircraft crews before they can respond. Gunfire smashes the bridge, killing or wounding officers and signalmen. In moments, Arashio's defenses are crippled. The Beaufighters are only the opening blow. Following close behind, the B-25s roar in low. Each bomber carries 2 500-pound bombs fitted with 5-second delay fuses, while their nose-mounted guns blaze away. Leading the charge is Major Ed Larner in his aircraft Betty's Dream. Flying at just 50 feet and over 220 mph, Larner lines up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Through his gun sight he sees sailors scrambling, some rushing to their posts, others diving for safety. At 300 yards he releases his bombs and pulls up hard, barely clearing the ship's mast. The bombs skip across the water, strike Shirayuki's hull just below the waterline, and detonate. The result is catastrophic. The thin hull cannot contain the blast. Confined spaces amplify the shockwave. Shirayuki's stern is blown apart, her aft magazine explodes, and the destroyer is torn in two. Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship is lost within minutes. Kimura himself, wounded by shrapnel, is pulled from the sea by the destroyer Shikanami. The Allied attack unfolds with exacting coordination. Every move, practiced, timed, and executed, falls into place with deadly efficiency. As the Beaufighters and B-25s tear through the convoy at sea level, high above them the B-17s of the 43rd Bombardment Group drop their bombs from 7,000 feet. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners who remain alive face an impossible decision: fire at the low-flying attackers that are seconds away from striking, or aim upward to disrupt the heavy bombers. Most choose to target the immediate danger, filling the sky with tracers and bursting shells. But the B-25s are moving too fast and flying too low for accurate fire. Lieutenant Charles Howe, piloting his B-25 Chatterbox, selects the transport Teiyo Maru as his target. The vessel, carrying more than 1,000 soldiers, tries desperately to avoid destruction. Her captain orders a sharp spiral maneuver to reduce the target area. But at skip-bombing altitude and speed, evasive moves are useless. Howe's bombs bounce across the water, striking true, one in the center of the ship and one near the stern. The explosions rip through her hull. Teiyo Maru lurches upward, then begins to list badly to port. Within 5 minutes, she capsizes, trapping hundreds of soldiers below deck. Meanwhile, the destroyer Tokitsukaze, carrying Lieutenant General Hatazō Adachi, becomes the focus of 3 B-25s at once. Her captain, Commander Masayoshi Motokura, tries to shield the transports by placing his ship between them and the attackers. His move is brave but hopeless. Multiple bombs smash into the destroyer, flooding her engine rooms and setting fires across her decks. Remarkably, General Adachi escapes injury and is transferred to the destroyer Yukikaze, but 19 of Tokitsukaze's crew are killed instantly by bomb blasts and strafing runs. Commander Kuboki's Arashio, already battered by the Beaufighters, now takes more punishment from the B-25s. One bomb destroys her steering gear, forcing the destroyer into an uncontrollable turn that ends with her colliding with the transport Nojima Maru. The two ships lock together in the chaos, both crippled. Flames engulf them and the crews have no choice but to abandon ship. Amid this devastation, moments of courage and despair play out. On the transport Kembu Maru, troops of the 51st Division, many of them untested in combat, struggle to launch life rafts as the ship lists dangerously. Officers with drawn swords attempt to enforce order, but panic takes hold. The soldiers realize the truth. They are hundreds of miles from any friendly coast, surrounded by sharks, and under relentless attack from Allied aircraft determined to destroy every ship that could save them. The destroyer Asashio, still crammed with the nearly 700 survivors rescued the previous day, fights back with everything it has. Captain Sato Yasuo, commanding Destroyer Division 8, orders every weapon to fire, creating a curtain of steel that briefly forces some B-25s to change course. Yet from above, a B-17 drops a 500-pound bomb that strikes Asashio's forward deck. The blast, combined with the overcrowding, causes catastrophic flooding. Captain Sato, following the code of the samurai, refuses to abandon his ship. Survivors recall his final words, "I'm tired. Just let me rest peacefully here. Moments later, Asashio sinks with immense loss of life, including most of the rescued troops. Captain Sato is later posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral for his actions. By 10:15 a.m., only 15 minutes after the assault began, the Japanese convoy has ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 7 transports are sinking or already gone, their wreckage and oil spreading for miles. Of the 8 destroyers, 4 are destroyed or fatally crippled. The survivors, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, move frantically through the debris field, pulling men from the water. But thousands remain stranded and the rescuers are far too few. At about 2:00 p.m., the second Allied wave arrives to find a battlefield of burning hulks, oil slicks, and drifting bodies. The remaining destroyers are forced to abandon rescue operations to defend themselves. The damaged transport Oyomaru, miraculously still afloat, is finished off by another round of skip bombing. Oil seeps continuously from the grave of the sunken Asashio, marking her resting place. As night falls on March 3rd, the full scope of the disaster is clear. Of the 6,900 men who sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1/200 reach Leh. Roughly 2,700 others are pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul by the surviving destroyers. Nearly 3,000 Japanese troops and sailors are dead, either killed in combat or drowned in the Bismarck Sea. In a single day, the carefully planned reinforcement for New Guinea's defense has been destroyed. The following day, March 4th, American PT boats and aircraft patrol the wreckage, attacking anything still afloat. The official reasoning is to prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore. Yet many Allied air crews are disturbed by the task, seeing it less as combat and more as the killing of helpless men. For some, the memory of that day will remain a lifelong burden. For the Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marks a turning point. Admiral Masatomi Adachi, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, writes in his diary, "We have lost the ability to move freely within range of enemy land-based aircraft. The convoy system, the foundation of our logistics, is finished. Never again will Japan risk daylight convoys to reinforce its garrisons. From this point on, only submarines and destroyers moving at night, the so-called Tokyo Express or rat runs, will attempt supply missions." The success of skip bombing revolutionizes Allied anti-shipping tactics across the Pacific. General George Kenney's innovation, created out of necessity, proves that land-based aircraft, properly trained and equipped, can dominate sea lanes as effectively as warships. Within months, these techniques spread from the Solomons to the Philippines, making Japanese shipping increasingly impossible. For Major Paul Pappy Gunn, the pioneer behind the B-25 gunship modifications, the victory is both professional triumph and personal vindication. With his family still imprisoned in the Philippines, every Japanese ship destroyed feels like a step toward their freedom. He continues to refine his designs, producing even deadlier aircraft. North American Aviation incorporates his modifications directly into new B-25 production, creating purpose-built gunships that will devastate Japanese shipping until war's end. Strategically, the disaster ripples through Japanese command. On March 25, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters orders priority shifted to defending New Guinea over the Solomon Islands, but without supply lines, the order is hollow. Garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and other New Guinea positions are now cut off, forced to fight until they are destroyed. Lieutenant General Adachi, who survived the sinking of Tokitsukaze, arrives at Leh with fewer than 1,200 men, less than 20% of the 6,900 who left Rabaul. His understrength and poorly supplied 18th Army faces the growing Allied offensive with no chance of reinforcement. In his first report back to Rabaul, Adachi writes only, "The situation is beyond recovery by normal means." His grim prediction soon proves correct. Within just 6 months, Leh falls to the advancing Allied forces, who attack by both land and air. The personal stories of survival from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea are filled with both tragedy and endurance. Captain Tamichi Hara of the destroyer Amatsukaze, which had not been part of the convoy, later interviews survivors and documents their experiences. One soldier from the 51st Division describes clinging to wreckage for 3 days before washing ashore on a Japanese-held island. Out of the 12 men who had begun on the same piece of debris, only 3 survived. The rest were lost to sharks, exhaustion, or hopelessness. Stories like this become all too common, as survivors gradually reach safety over the following weeks. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, though wounded, survives the ordeal. He faces no official punishment for the disaster, as Japan's high command recognizes the impossible circumstances he faced. Yet Kimura never again commands a convoy. The psychological weight of watching his force destroyed in minutes by a new form of attack leaves deep scars. Unable to anticipate or counter such tactics, something in the veteran officer breaks. For the rest of the war, he holds only administrative posts, haunted by memories of the Bismarck Sea. For the Americans, the pilots who took part in the strike become instant legends throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. Major Ed Larner receives the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the skip bombing runs. Still in private, many aviators struggle with conflicting emotions. Lieutenant Charles Howe writes to his wife, "We destroyed them completely. It was necessary, I know, but I can't forget the sight of all those men in the water. This isn't the kind of war I thought I'd be fighting." General Douglas MacArthur, always eager for publicity, issues a dramatic communique claiming that 22 ships and 15,000 Japanese troops were destroyed. These numbers are massive exaggerations. The actual Japanese losses amount to 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and about 3,000 men. Yet the propaganda value is immense. In American headlines, the battle is portrayed as revenge for Pearl Harbor, and proof that Allied ingenuity and courage could overcome Japanese strength. The truth, as is often the case in war, is far more complicated. For the Australians, the victory carries special significance. The Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron played a key role by suppressing Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, enabling the skip bombing attacks to succeed. Too often overshadowed by their American allies, the RAF finally gains recognition. Squadron leader Claude Ridley receives the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions. But even he admits later, it wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Inside Japan, the Army and Navy quickly fall into bitter blame. Army leaders argue the Navy failed to provide proper protection, insisting that aircraft carriers should have been assigned to guard the convoy, despite the fact that Japan's carrier force was already stretched beyond its limits. The Navy fires back, claiming the Army's insistence on daylight convoy operations against overwhelming Allied air power was reckless and near criminal. This rivalry, which had plagued Japan throughout the war, prevents any real attempt to develop countermeasures to skip bombing. In the wider picture of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands alongside Midway and Guadalcanal as a turning point. It proves that air power, when used correctly, can dominate the sea lanes as effectively as any naval fleet. For island nations like Japan and Britain dependent on shipping for survival, the implications are enormous. The age of the battleship is ending. The age of the aircraft has truly begun. The lessons of the battle fuel rapid innovation. The Allies refine their skip bombing techniques, introducing new bomb sites and training programs to push accuracy even further. They also begin experimenting with rockets and larger bombs capable of sinking heavily armored ships. The Japanese eventually attempt countermeasures, barrage balloons, smoke screens, and special anti-aircraft shells for low-flying targets. But these measures come too late to make a difference. One of the most poignant consequences of the battle is felt by the families of the dead. In Japan, where casualty reports are tightly censored, many relatives wait months or even years for word. Mrs. Yamada, whose husband was aboard the transport Teiyo Maru, receives only a short notice saying he had died gloriously for the Emperor in the South Seas. She never learns what really happened, the terror of the skip bombing attack, the fires on the sinking ship, the desperate fight for life in the oil-slicked waters. For her and thousands like her, the truth remains hidden forever. On the Allied side, the intelligence officers who broke Japanese codes understand the crucial role they played. Without access to intercepted communications, the timing and location of the convoy would have been unknown. Yet there is also danger. If Japan realizes its codes have been compromised, they will change them, and the Allies will lose their advantage. For that reason, great care is taken to make the victory appear to be the result of reconnaissance flights and chance sightings, rather than code-breaking. The propaganda war continues long after the fighting ends. Tokyo radio broadcasts insist the convoy reached Leh with only minor losses and mock American claims as lies. But the Japanese troops already stationed at Leh know the truth. They see with their own eyes that the relief force has been shattered, leaving them cut off. Morale, already strained by jungle hardship and shortages, collapses further. In Washington and Canberra, the battle is hailed as proof that the tide has turned. Political leaders who once doubted MacArthur's aggressive plans through New Guinea now rally behind him. Resources that might have been sent elsewhere are instead directed into the Southwest Pacific. In many ways, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea cements the Allied strategy that will ultimately lead to the liberation of the Philippines. The environmental impact, though ignored at the time, is significant. Thousands of tons of oil leak from the sunken ships, spreading across the Bismarck Sea and fouling reefs and beaches. The wrecks, many still filled with ammunition, supplies, and human remains, become underwater tombs that remain hazardous even today. Modern surveys have revealed vessels still upright on the seafloor, cargo intact, silently marking the place where thousands lost their lives. For military historians, the battle becomes a textbook case of modern warfare. It demonstrates how intelligence, innovation, and air superiority can decide the outcome of a campaign. War colleges worldwide study it, highlighting the vulnerability of surface ships to air power and the need for cooperation between air and naval forces. At the human level, courage is remembered on both sides. Japanese destroyer captains who placed their ships between transports and enemy bombers, knowing the cost. Allied pilots who braved heavy anti-aircraft fire at low altitude to strike their targets. Sailors who risked their lives pulling comrades from shark-infested burning waters. War, for all its cruelty, revealed both the worst and the best in human nature. As the Pacific War moves forward, veterans of the Bismarck Sea are scattered. Some continue through the island-hopping campaigns of the Solomons and the Philippines. Others are assigned to training, passing on the dangerous lessons of skip bombing to new aircrews. A few, worn down by the intensity of combat, are sent home carrying wounds, both physical and psychological, that will never fully heal. General George Kenney, who oversaw the Allied air operations, goes on to greater fame, eventually commanding all Allied air forces in the Pacific. But he always remembers the Bismarck Sea as his greatest victory, the battle that proved once and for all that air power could decide the fate of fleets. In his memoirs written years after the war, one Allied commander reflected, "We changed the nature of war that day. Ships could no longer operate within range of land-based aircraft unless they had full control of the skies above them. It was a lesson written in blood, but one that needed to be learned." For Japan, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a disaster from which they never truly recovered. The loss of a division's worth of troops and equipment, along with the crushing psychological blow, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese control in New Guinea. Within a year, most of their garrisons were either wiped out or cut off, left to wither in the jungle as the war moved past them. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere effectively sank with the ships and men lost in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. The revolution in tactics, sparked by skip bombing, did not end with the war. Modern anti-ship missiles still rely on the same principle, a high-speed, low-altitude approach to avoid detection and overwhelm defenses. The B-25 bombers of 1943, modified into gunships and used with skip bombing techniques, can rightly be seen as the ancestors of today's advanced maritime strike aircraft. The lesson that adaptation and innovation can overcome what seems impossible remains just as relevant today as it was in 1943. The legacy of the battle depends on perspective. For the Allies, it was a landmark victory, a triumph of innovation, training, and bravery. For Japan, it was a tragedy, a symbol of their worsening position, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy whose industrial power grew stronger with every passing month. For the families of those lost on both sides, it was something far simpler. The day their fathers, husbands, and sons disappeared into the vast Pacific. Today, the Bismarck Sea is calm. Its surface is crossed by fishing boats and the occasional research vessel, studying the wrecks that lie below. But for those who know what happened here on March 3, 1943, these waters tell another story of desperate innovation, of courage in the face of almost certain death, and of the brutal cost of war, where victories are measured not just in ships sunk but in lives destroyed. The battle also raises questions that go beyond tactics. The attacks on survivors in the water, even if militarily justified, have left an uncomfortable moral legacy. Where is the line between necessity and humanity? Can something be both tactically right and morally wrong? These questions, first raised in the aftermath of the Bismarck Sea, continue to be debated by military leaders and ethicists today. For survivors, the war never really ended. Japanese veterans, even decades later, spoke of nightmares filled with low-flying B-25s skimming the waves. American airmen remembered the faces of Japanese sailors struggling in the sea, wondering if they could or should, have done something different. Australian Beaufighter crews recalled the sound of their cannons ripping through steel and flesh. These invisible wounds, psychological scars, may be the battle's most enduring legacy. The strategic impact of the battle shaped the remainder of the Pacific War. Japan's inability to reinforce its garrisons meant the Allies could advance more quickly, skipping strongholds that otherwise would have required bloody assaults. Allied lives were saved as a result of the victory at the Bismarck Sea, but this also meant Japanese lives were spent instead. Another reminder of the harsh arithmetic of war. In military academies around the world, the battle is studied as an early example of what we now call effects-based operations, achieving major strategic goals through precision and coordination rather than overwhelming force. It proved that with accurate intelligence, creative tactics, and flawless execution, a smaller force could defeat a larger one. That lesson still resonates today in an age of precision strikes, drones, and tight defense budgets. The environmental legacy of the battle is still visible. The wrecks are slowly corroding, releasing oil and chemicals into the sea. Unexploded ordnance remains dangerous for fishermen and divers. Attempts to preserve these wrecks as war graves often clash with illegal salvage operations, seeking valuable metals. In a way, the battle still claims victims long after the last veteran has passed away. Cultural memory of the battle varies across nations. In Australia, it is celebrated as the moment when the RAF proved itself equal to any air force in the world. In the United States, it is often overshadowed by larger clashes like Midway or the Philippine Sea. In Japan, it has largely faded into obscurity, one disaster among many in a war that ended in atomic fire. These differences reflect how nations choose to remember, and sometimes to forget, their military pasts. The role of intelligence cannot be overstated. Codebreakers who decrypted Japanese messages, coast watchers who tracked ship movements, and reconnaissance pilots who spotted the convoy all contributed to the victory. The battle demonstrated that in modern warfare, information is as valuable as firepower. Knowing the enemy's location, movements, and intentions provided an advantage no amount of courage could overcome. The human story of the battle extends beyond soldiers and sailors. For the native peoples of New Guinea and nearby islands, the battle brought both opportunity and hardship. Wreckage provided salvageable materials, but their fishing grounds were scarred, and the destruction of modern warfare arrived on their doorstep. Their voices, rarely recorded, are part of the wider legacy of the conflict. Looking back from the perspective of 8 decades, what lessons stand out? Above all, that innovation in war always comes with a human cost. Skip bombing was ingenious, but it was also designed to kill more efficiently. The B-25s that tore through the Japanese convoy were instruments of destruction. However much we admire their tactical brilliance, yet the Allies fought in a context of survival, facing an enemy that had launched unprovoked wars of conquest across the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers aboard those transports were not innocents, they were instruments of imperial expansion. The moral clarity of the Second World War provides some justification for the brutal efficiency of the victory. The battle also highlights the importance of adaptation. Both sides entered the Pacific War expecting battleship duels to decide control of the seas. Instead, air power rewrote the rules. Those who adapted, like General George Kenney and his air crews, succeeded. Those who clung to outdated doctrine, like Japanese commanders who believed destroyers could shield convoys from air attack, paid a terrible price. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea still offers lessons for the present. It shows how quickly technology can change the battlefield, how innovation can upend entire strategies almost overnight. In today's world of cyber warfare, drones, and artificial intelligence, the message remains clear. Adaptation is essential to survival, and above all, the stories remind us that war is about people, not just strategies or numbers. The 3,000 Japanese who died in the Bismarck Sea each had families and futures. Every Allied pilot who flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire had someone waiting at home. This battle, like all battles, was not just a clash of machines and tactics. It was a human tragedy, written across the waters of the Pacific. The countless personal tragedies of the Pacific War, repeated millions of times, show the real price of conflict. As the last veterans of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea pass away, their first-hand voices disappear with them. What remains are official reports, photographs, and written histories. The danger is that this event will one day be remembered only as symbols on a map or lines in a textbook, stripped of the human reality behind it. That cannot be allowed. History is made by people under crushing pressure, often with only fragments of information and no clear moral answers. The battle's impact on military development after the war was immense. The success of skip bombing directly led to greater investment in maritime strike aircraft and anti-ship weapons. The clear vulnerability of surface ships to air attack drove improvements in anti-aircraft defenses, radar technology, and eventually surface-to-air missiles. This cycle of offense and defense, aircraft finding ways to strike harder while ships searched for ways to survive, began at Bismarck Sea and continues even today. For each nation involved, the battle became part of its military tradition. The United States Air Force highlights it as proof that independent air operations could decide outcomes. The Royal Australian Air Force points to it as an example of their strength in combined operations. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force studies it as a cautionary case, showing how fleets without air cover are exposed to destruction. These different interpretations have shaped how modern militaries think about war and how they prepare for it. Yet the ethical questions raised still linger. Attacking survivors in the water, even if it made military sense to stop them from reinforcing Japanese positions, challenges the idea of honorable warfare. Sinking transports crowded with soldiers raises questions about where the line lies between combatants and non-combatants. These moral gray areas, first exposed after the Bismarck Sea, remain relevant today as modern weapons grow deadlier and more precise. In the wider story of the Pacific War, the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point. It was here that the Allies seized the initiative in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese expansion was not only stopped, it was pushed backward. The psychological effect was powerful. For the Allies, it proved that Japanese forces could not only be defeated, but completely destroyed. For Japan, it was a crushing blow to morale. After this, the question was no longer if Japan would lose the war, but how long the fight would drag on and at what cost. The battle also stands as an example of how joint operations can succeed. The victory required coordination between American and Australian forces, between naval and air units, and between intelligence officers and frontline commanders. Achieving that integration was never simple, but when done correctly, it produced devastating results. Much of today's doctrine on joint operations can be traced back to lessons drawn from Bismarck Sea. For anyone studying military history, the battle delivers several lessons. Intelligence was critical. Knowing enemy intentions and locations made the difference. Innovation mattered. The willingness to try new tactics like skip bombing, even if risky, paid off. Air superiority proved essential, and surface ships without protection from above were shown to be dangerously exposed. All of these lessons, bought with blood in 1943, remain highly relevant for today's military planners. The human side of the battle is just as important. The invention of skip bombing and the modification of B-25 bombers into gunships highlight human creativity applied to war. The courage of pilots flying into heavy anti-aircraft fire and sailors pulling survivors from flaming waters showed determination under extreme danger. Yet the suffering of those who burned, drowned, or vanished into the sea is a reminder of the terrible human price of these innovations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was both a tactical success and a human catastrophe. It was innovation and destruction, bravery and suffering, a necessary action for victory yet a lasting moral dilemma. These contradictions are not unique, but they are sharply visible in this battle because the success was so absolute, and the human loss so overwhelming. The legacy even comes down to seconds. Japanese captains had only moments to respond to skip bombing runs, with 5-second fuses giving them little chance. In those seconds, the very nature of naval warfare changed. The era when surface fleets could operate freely ended. Air power proved supreme. The need for rapid adaptation in combat was shown beyond question. Today, as tensions again rise in the Pacific, the lessons from 1943 remain alive. Air superiority, naval vulnerability to precision strikes, and the critical role of intelligence and surveillance, all were proven in the Bismarck Sea. Those lessons continue to influence strategy and planning across the world. But for those who survived, the battle never truly ended. Japanese veterans lived with nightmares of B-25 skimming the waves. American pilots carried memories of faces in the water, asking themselves if they should have acted differently. Australian crews still recalled the sound of their cannons cutting into steel and flesh. These invisible scars may be the battle's deepest legacy. The battle also reshaped the course of the Pacific campaign. By preventing Japanese reinforcements from reaching New Guinea, Allied forces advanced faster, skipping heavily fortified positions and saving thousands of Allied lives. Yet that saving of lives came at the expense of thousands of Japanese soldiers left to die, another moral weight that lingers. Environmental consequences still remain. Wrecks slowly leak oil and chemicals into the sea. Unexploded munitions pose dangers to divers and fishermen. Illegal salvage threatens these sites, which should be preserved as war graves. In a way, the battle continues to harm long after the last participants have gone. Cultural memory varies. In Australia, it is celebrated as a moment when the RAF proved itself on the world stage. In the United States, it is often overshadowed by Midway or the Philippine Sea. In Japan, it is remembered, if at all, as just one more disaster in a war that ended in nuclear devastation. These differences reflect how nations shape and reshape their military histories. The importance of intelligence cannot be overstated. The men and women of Ultra who broke Japanese codes, the coast watchers who relayed movements, and the reconnaissance pilots who spotted the convoy were as vital as those who dropped the bombs. The battle proved that in modern war, information can outweigh courage or firepower. The story also includes the people of New Guinea and the nearby islands. For them, the battle brought both opportunity and hardship. They salvaged wreckage and supplies, but also saw their fishing grounds disrupted and their lands torn apart by the arrival of modern war. Their stories remain largely unheard, but they too are part of this history. Looking back after 8 decades, the central lesson is clear. Innovation wins battles, but always at a human cost. Skip bombing was designed to kill more effectively. The modified B-25s were built for destruction. While we may admire the ingenuity, we cannot forget what they were created to do. Yet in the context of the time, when the Allies faced an expansionist empire, those methods were seen as necessary. The moral clarity of the Second World War compared with later conflicts partly explains why these actions were accepted. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains one of the clearest examples of how fast military doctrines can collapse. Before the Pacific War, naval experts imagined great gun duels between battleships. In reality, air power rewrote the rules. Those who adapted, like General George Kenney and his airmen, found success. Those who held to old doctrines, like Admiral Masatomi Kimura and his convoy commanders, paid the price. In an era of cyber warfare, drones, and artificial intelligence, the same truth applies. Innovation and adaptation are essential. The Bismarck Sea is still teaching lessons. The human element must not be forgotten. Each of the 3,000 Japanese soldiers who perished had families. Each Allied pilot flying into danger had someone waiting for them. These lives were not just numbers. They were individuals whose worlds ended in those 15 minutes of destruction. The Bismarck Sea was not just a victory or a defeat. It was a human story of loss, courage, adaptation, and tragedy. Beneath today's calm waters lie the remains of ships and men, silent reminders of March 3, 1943. Their presence reminds us that the peace and prosperity of today were bought at terrible cost. This is the story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, not told to glorify war but to understand it in all its complexity, so that future generations might learn and build a better path forward.